My name is Mara Ellison. I'm 63. The sound of the gavel cracked through the courtroom like a reminder that none of this belonged to me anymore, not even the silence. Motion granted, Judge Alcott said, adjusting his glasses without looking up. The court will allow additional time to review the medical records. My son's attorney smiled as if he'd just won a championship. Evan leaned back in his chair beside him, shoulders relaxed, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth, and this was the fifth delay, another small victory for his lawyer. Though I felt none of it. 5 times I had dressed carefully, sat quietly, and listened while strangers debated the worth of the life I built with my husband. Michael's will wasn't complicated. The house on Queen Anne Hill, the modest savings from his nursing pension, half to me, half to Evan. But Evan's lawyer claimed discrepancies in account statements, suggesting the distribution might be unequal. His lawyer's voice droned on about inconsistencies and undisclosed financial interests, as if my 30 years of marriage were a trick. I kept my hands folded in my lap to stop their trembling. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and rain-soaked coats. Outside, Seattle was gray, heavy with drizzle, the kind that made everything blur at the edges. I'd worked night shifts through worse weather, through harder years. But this kind of cold, the kind that came from your own child, was different. When the hearing ended, the judge gathered his files without acknowledgement. Evan stood, speaking quietly with his attorney, then glanced toward me as if I were an inconvenience he'd like to have rescheduled. For a moment, I caught a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, quickly buried beneath calculation. Clara Ruiz, my attorney and the closest thing I had to a friend in that room, touched my elbow. "We'll appeal the delay," she whispered. I nodded, though we both knew the motion would be denied like all the others. Still, something in me had shifted. I'd stopped waiting for fairness. As we stepped into the damp afternoon air, I looked back at the courthouse's stone steps and thought of the home Michael built with his hands, now treated as evidence. Tomorrow, I promised myself, I'd start finding out why this judge always said yes to my son. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain tapped against the window like a metronome counting the years backward, pulling me toward the boy I used to know. Evan was born in the middle of a February storm. Michael had fallen asleep in the waiting room, exhausted after a double shift at the firehouse, and I remember laughing through the pain, thinking our son would grow up used to thunder. For years, he was my shadow, always curious, always hungry for stories. He'd sit on the kitchen counter while I packed his lunch, asking about the patients I'd cared for that day. "You fix people," he'd say. "That's what I want to do too." I didn't realize he meant fixing in a different way, managing accounts, balancing books, rather than healing wounds. Somewhere between college and his first accounting job, something hardened in him. Maybe it was ambition. Maybe it was the woman he married. Leah appeared polished, confident, always perfectly composed. At the first dinner we shared, she asked how much the house was worth before she asked how I was. I remember smiling politely, but something in my stomach tightened. Later, at Michael's funeral, she stood beside my son with dry eyes and whispered things I couldn't hear. In court, she sits behind him now, whispering again. Her eyes flicker toward me whenever the judge speaks, as if measuring how close I am to breaking. Evan never looks back. He used to send flowers on my birthday, call when he got a promotion, bring me soup when I was sick. Now his messages come through attorneys. Clara says he's just under pressure, that grief distorts people. Maybe. But sometimes I wonder if I raised him too well to plan, to calculate, to win, and maybe, without knowing it, I'd taught him to fight meticulously, strategically. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Hallway. By the 3rd month of hearings, even Clara stopped pretending it was coincidence. Judge Alcott granted every request from Evan's attorney with the same measured nod, the same soft tap of his pen before saying, "Motion granted." Not once did he question their filings or ask for additional evidence. I started noticing the small things, the ones that reveal where loyalty truly lies. When I arrived early one morning, the clerk called softly, passing a folder to the judge. The familiarity in their tone was subtle but unmistakable connections that weren't on the record. I stood by the vending machine, pretending to choose a snack I didn't want, listening as the judge replied, "Tell him 1 o'clock works." My hands felt cold even though the machine's motor blew warm air. I'd never thought of justice as something that could be scheduled between lunches. When the hearing began, Alcott barely acknowledged Clara's argument. She spoke clearly, citing procedure and precedent, her voice calm but edged with frustration. He didn't look up from his notes. When Evan's lawyer stood, the judge smiled. Afterward, Clara and I walked toward the elevators. "You saw that, right?" she asked quietly. Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. I nodded. "It's like they've already written the ending," I said. She stopped walking, lowering her voice. "I think your son's firm has ties to Alcott. I'm checking. But we need to tread carefully. He's protected." That word stayed with me, protected. The idea that my son might be hiding behind someone else's power? As we stepped into the gray afternoon, rain streaking the courthouse steps, I realized I wasn't just fighting my son anymore. I was fighting the people who taught him how to win. That night, the rain wouldn't stop. It rolled down the window in long silver streaks, blurring the lights of Queen Anne Hill into soft smudges. I made tea I didn't drink and stared at the cedar chest sitting by the window. Michael's chest. It had been there for years. A quiet piece of him I never opened unless I needed to remember. The lock was old but familiar. Inside, the scent of cedar and thyme hit me all at once. His service medals were still there, along with the faded letters he'd written when Evan was a baby. Beneath them lay a folder I didn't recognize, sealed with a strip of brittle tape. My hands hesitated before breaking it open. Inside were copies of bank statements neatly stapled, labeled, dated within the past 2 years. The transfers moved in steady rhythm amounts, just under reporting limits. Between Evan Ellison and Associates and RA Consulting Group, the initials matched something I'd seen in Clara's earlier files. My pulse thudded in my ears. I called Clara, unable to trust myself to interpret what I was seeing. She arrived within the hour, rain still clinging to her coat, her expression sharpening as she read through the pages. "These are direct transfers," she murmured, recurring. "The judge appears to have consulted for companies linked to Evan's firm, raising questions about conflicts of interest in probate decisions." She checked the signatures against her files. They matched clean, deliberate, undeniable. She set the papers down carefully, as if they might burn through the table. "Mara, this isn't just procedural bias. This is ethics-level corruption." I leaned back, feeling the world tilt a little. The courthouse, the delays, the polite smiles. They weren't about my husband's will. They were about keeping these numbers buried. Clara rubbed her temples, thinking aloud, if this surfaces, Alcott's career is over. Evan's firm could face federal inquiry. The kettle clicked behind us. Forgotten. The rain outside softened to a whisper, but my chest felt hollow, heavy. Michael had always told me the truth had a weight of its own. I finally understood what he meant. Looking at my son's name beside those transfers, I realized the inheritance wasn't what he was fighting for at all. He was fighting to keep me from opening this box. 2 days later, Clara called to say someone from the courthouse wanted to meet. "She doesn't want to be seen," Clara warned. "Her name's Joyce McHenry, court clerk for Alcott's division." We met at a small cafe tucked behind the municipal building, the kind of place where no one lingers long. Joyce arrived in a plain gray coat, hair pulled into a loose bun, eyes ringed with exhaustion. She looked like someone who had spent years watching things she wasn't allowed to say. "I've seen your name on the docket," she began softly, sliding her coffee aside. "I shouldn't be here. But some of us still believe the system should work." From her purse, she drew a folded envelope and pushed it across the table. Inside were photocopied calendar pages, handwritten entries from the judge's private log, 3 separate meetings listed between R. Alcott and Leonard Sloan. Evan's attorney. None of them were on record. My fingers trembled slightly as I traced the dates. Each meeting fell just before the delays in my case. "These are copies," Joyce said quickly. "The originals will disappear soon. Trust me, he's done this before." She lowered her voice. "They'll come after you if you use them, but you deserve to know." I wanted to thank her, but words felt too small. Instead, I folded the envelope and slid it into my bag. Clara's eyes met mine over the rim of her cup. "Now we have a trail," she whispered. As Joyce left, she turned back once, her expression tight with something between fear and relief. I watched her disappear into the drizzle, realizing what it meant to step out of silence. My pulse steadied, not from calm, but from direction. Fear had finally found its purpose. Evan called the next morning, his tone almost casual. "Mom, let's have lunch, just the 2 of us." It was the first invitation in months. Part of me wanted to believe it was peace he wanted, not negotiation. We met at a restaurant overlooking the Sound, one we'd gone to when he was younger, after his baseball games. The same gray water, the same slow ferries moving through the fog. But the boy who used to order pancakes was gone. In his place sat a man checking his watch, wearing a suit too sharp for sentiment. "I think we can settle this quietly," he began, setting down his coffee. "It's gotten messy. The lawyers are making it worse." I waited. He pulled a folder from his briefcase, sliding it across the table. "A transfer agreement. You sign over the Queen Anne house under this proposed settlement, and I'll wire $150,000 as compensation. It's an offer to avoid further legal conflict." The words were smooth, rehearsed. I recognized the careful pause between each one, the rhythm of someone selling something he already knew was wrong. I looked at the folder, then at him. His jaw tightened when I didn't reach for it. "Evan," I said quietly, "your father built that house with his hands. It's not just property." He leaned back, expression flattening. "Then think of this as simplifying things." For a moment, I saw the flicker of the boy he'd been the one who believed fairness meant doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. Then it vanished. I closed the folder and pushed it gently back. "No," I said, "not like this." The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict. For the next 3 nights, my kitchen turned into a war room. Papers covered the table, bank records, photocopied calendars, Joyce's affidavit, and Clara's yellow legal pads filled with neat handwriting. The rain outside never stopped. It kept time for us, steady and relentless. Clara worked methodically, organizing every exhibit with the precision of someone who understood how fragile justice could be. "We don't need noise," she said, sliding a folder toward me. "We need facts that speak louder than outrage." I reread the affidavit, tracing Joyce's looping signature. She had risked her job to tell the truth. Her statement was clear. Judge Alcott had met privately with Evan's attorney 3 times during active proceedings. The pattern matched every unexplained delay. Next came the bank records, Michael's old folder. Now evidence. Clara marked each transfer in red ink, drawing thin lines between the judge's consulting account and Evan's firm. It looked clinical on paper, almost detached. But to me, it was betrayal in numbers and ink. When Clara finally leaned back, rubbing her eyes, she said softly, "You need to write your own statement. Your voice matters more than mine in that courtroom." I sat at the end of the table, pen hovering above a blank page. Words didn't come easily anymore. But then I thought of Michael's calloused hands sanding the window frames of the Queen Anne house, of Joyce slipping an envelope across a cafe table, of the way the judge's smile had dismissed me like an afterthought. I began to write simple sentences. No emotion, no accusation, just truth. By midnight, my hand ached. But my voice was finally on paper calm, factual, unshakable. Clara gathered the documents into a single binder, sealing it with a quiet finality. "It's ready," she said. And for the first time, I believed her. The courtroom was colder than usual, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and refused to leave. I sat beside Clara at the plaintiff's table, the binder of evidence resting between us. Evan didn't look at me. His lawyer whispered something to Judge Alcott's clerk, who smiled tightly before retreating to her seat. "Ms. Ellison," the judge began, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've reviewed your objections. You seem to misunderstand how probate procedure works. These matters are complex. I can assure you, your son's counsel is operating within the law." His words were slow, deliberate, as if explaining arithmetic to a child. Clara's hand brushed mine, a silent reminder to stay calm. But the moment he smiled, I felt something inside me harden. I rose to my feet. "Your Honor, I wish to submit evidence indicating a potential conflict of interest, documented here." The words landed heavier than I expected. The clerk froze mid-keystroke. Clara slid the binder toward me, and I carried it to the bench, my steps steady. "These," I said, placing the documents before him, "are records of direct financial transfers from my son's firm to a consulting company under your name, R.A. Consulting Group. Each transaction occurred shortly before rulings in this case." Alcott's color drained from his face. "This is highly irregular," he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Clara stood, her tone crisp. "Attached, you'll also find an affidavit from Joyce McHenry, court clerk, confirming private meetings between the judge and opposing counsel." "Your Honor, these are serious allegations," the lawyer began. Alcott held up his hand, his tone unusually tight. "Please be seated." He flipped through the pages, the rustle of paper unnaturally loud. The courtroom had gone silent. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade. Evan finally turned toward me. His expression wasn't anger. This time it was something closer to disbelief. Like he'd just realized who I really was. Judge Alcott cleared his throat, but no sound came. He closed the binder slowly, hands trembling. "The court will recess," he said, barely audible. I stood still, watching him rise and leave through the side door, his shoulders bent under the weight of the truth he'd tried to bury. For the first time in months, the silence belonged to me. By the end of the week, Judge Alcott had filed his formal recusal. The court clerk read the statement in a trembling voice, noting his health-related leave of absence. Everyone in the room understood what it meant. A new judge, a woman named Eleanor Sharp, took the bench the following Monday. She was brisk, unsentimental, and uninterested in excuses. Clara presented the documents once more concise, organized, irrefutable. Evan's attorney objected weakly, but the fight was already gone from his voice. "The evidence indicates clear procedural impropriety," Judge Sharp said. "The court finds in favor of Mrs. Ellison. The estate shall be distributed according to the original will." The words settled over the room like dust after a storm. Clara let out a quiet breath. I didn't move. Across the aisle, Evan kept his eyes fixed on the table. His lawyer leaned in, whispering, but Evan didn't respond. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with notepads and microphones, asking about the ethics investigation rumored to be underway. Clara shielded me from most of them, ushering me toward the car. "Let the paperwork speak for itself," she said. "You've done enough." I nodded. though the victory felt strangely hollow. There was no satisfaction in it, only a slow unwinding of tension that left me lightheaded for months. I'd carried the weight of proving what should have been obvious, that truth still mattered. Now that it was done, the relief came with its own ache. As we drove away, I glanced through the window and saw Evan standing alone on the courthouse steps, rain darkening the shoulders of his suit. He looked smaller somehow, like a man finally realizing what he'd lost and what could never be bought back. Weeks passed before I allowed myself to breathe, like a person who no longer expected bad news. Seattle had slipped into its gentler kind of rain, the steady mist that softened even the sharpest corners of the city. I filled the balcony planters with herbs, rosemary, thyme, a little lavender things Michael had loved. Their scent rose warm against the damp air, faint but certain. The Queen Anne house was mine again, though it felt different now, quieter, almost humbled by what had been fought for and nearly lost. Clara stopped by once to bring the final court documents and a bouquet of tulips. "It's really over," she said, smiling in that small, tired way of someone who'd carried more than her share of storms. That night, I drafted the announcement for the Michael Ellison Memorial Nursing Scholarship, a modest fund to help students who couldn't afford their training. It wasn't much, but it felt right, like something Michael would have built with his hands if he were still here. When the phone buzzed, I saw Evan's name on the screen. The message was short. "Sorry." No explanations. No defense. Just one word. I stared at it for a moment, then deleted it. The ache didn't vanish, but it no longer hollowed me out. Some wounds, I realized, simply became part of the landscape. Outside, the drizzle turned to a fine silver curtain. I stepped to the porch and switched on the light. It glowed softly against the rain. "This light isn't for waiting anymore," I whispered. "It's for peace."